This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 466 of the Late Round Podcast, on many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Championship week is always bittersweet. I love the football season. I love the ups and downs, the highs that we get when we win fantasy matchups at the last second, even the tilts. I love it all. I love everything about fantasy football. But doing this stuff each week and analyzing the game, I couldn't do it all year round. It's exhausting. So I'm sad to see the fantasy season go, but I'm also happy that I'm going to be able to get normal sleep again. For this final 15 transaction show, in order for you guys to get the most out of it, I mostly just have ads that you can make off the waiver wire this week. It's pretty straightforward. Hopefully this show has helped you throughout the season, though. I know it's something that I put a lot of effort into, and I hope that shows. I appreciate all of you for listening, providing feedback, and going along this 15 transactions journey with me each and every week. Now let's win a fantasy title. But before digging into the transactions this week, did you know that basketball is back? And this season, NBA Hall of Famer Charles Barkley has joined the FanDuel team. Jolly old St. Chuck is giving away over $30 million in gifts to all FanDuel customers, including free fantasy entries, free site credit, risk-free bets, and Charles Barkley odds boosts. From the opening tip to the final buzzer, there are so many ways to bet on FanDuel Sportsbook this NBA season. And if you sign up today, FanDuel will let you place your first bet risk-free. That's right, they'll give you up to $1,000 back if you don't win. And when you do win, FanDuel pays you your winnings in as little as 24 hours. With the NBA season here, now is the perfect time to give FanDuel a shot. Must be 21 years or older and present in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, West Virginia, Indiana, Colorado, Iowa, and Tennessee. First online real money wager only. Site credit is non-withdrawable and expires in 14 days. Restrictions apply. See sportsbook.fanduel.com for details. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-522-4700 in Colorado, 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa, 1-800-9-WITH-IT in Indiana, 1-800-GAMBLER in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Illinois, Tennessee Redline 1-800-889-9789, or in West Virginia, visit 1-800-GAMBLER.net. Add Le'Veon Bell. So Le'Veon Bell's rostered in 53% of Yahoo leagues. That's a lot of leagues. Usually whenever I talk about guys to add off the waiver wire, they're rostered in way fewer leagues than that. But this is a different week. I have to be a little bit looser with the restrictions in week 16 because I'm giving you guys a lot of ads this week. But yes, you should be adding Le'Veon Bell. Clyde Edwards-Helaire got hurt in that game against the Saints. He has both hip and ankle injuries now. That's going to make Le'Veon Bell the 1A in this Chiefs backfield. And this week, they get the Falcons. Now, the Falcons aren't that good of a matchup on paper. They actually rank as the third toughest matchup against running backs when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed. But the Chiefs have almost a 32-point implied team total according to FanDuel Sportsbook. So if they're going to put up that many points, Le'Veon Bell is probably going to have something to do with it. He's going to have some production. Like Leonard Fournette in Week 15, there should be scoring opportunities for Le'Veon Bell. Add Tony Pollard. So again, there's a chance that Tony Pollard is not available in your league. He's out there in about 55% of Yahoo leagues right now, which honestly is a lot more than I expected, given Ezekiel Elliott didn't play this past week. But if you watched football in Week 15, you saw what Tony Pollard did. He finished his day against San Francisco with 31.2 PPR points. That was the best performance at running back this week. He had 75% of Dallas's running back rushes, and he had a 27.3% target share. That target share for Tony Pollard in this game was higher than Ezekiel Elliott's season high, which was 21.2%. Now, I don't know if Elliott is going to play this week. Since he was somewhat of a surprise inactive, I would lean that Elliott's going to play. But regardless, you should be prepared. Add Tony Pollard. If Zeke does go, maybe you don't play Pollard, but if he doesn't, then you have a strong option. Add Devine Ozigbo. So James Robinson hurt his ankle in Sunday's game against the Ravens, and it feels like no one's talking about it. It's not being reported really anywhere. But if he misses Week 16, then you're probably looking at Devine Ozigbo being the early down guy for Jacksonville. And then there's a chance that Dare Ogunbowale is the guy who's going to catch passes out of the backfield. So this is not an ideal scenario whatsoever. Don't get me wrong, and they play the Bears. So to me, you're adding Devine Ozigbo. I hope you don't have to start him, but he could be like an RB3 this week. Add Chad Hansen. So the Texans have now played 3 games without Will Fuller. In those 3 games, Chad Hansen has seen target shares of 18.9%, 25.9%, and 7.9%. He's finished as a top 30 wide receiver in every single contest. Now, I will say it's a little bit discouraging that he only had a 7.9% target share in Week 15. But that's why we look at the peripherals. Because he still had a 91% snap rate, and according to Pro Football Focus, he ran the second most routes at wide receiver for Houston. In Week 16, he gets a decent matchup against Cincinnati, so I do think that Chad Hansen should be added. Drop Christian Kirk. Now, I'm giving you 2 drop recommendations on today's show, so you have an idea of how I look at guys to drop heading into championship week. Because you don't want to drop players who might be able to produce for your opponent. I don't think Christian Kirk is that guy, at least predictably. Kyler Murray had 406 passing yards on Sunday. Christian Kirk had 33 of them. He hasn't finished higher than wide receiver 48 in weekly scoring since Week 9. And his highest single game target share over his last 3 contests is 12.5%. You can't trust that. You cannot trust this production. That's why you can drop Christian Kirk. Add Jalen Hurts. This is the 3rd straight week that I'm talking about adding Jalen Hurts on this show. But he's still somehow rostered in fewer than 40% of Yahoo leagues. You need to add Jalen Hurts. If you're sitting here listening to this for the 3rd time in 3 weeks and he's still on your waiver wire, what are you doing? Add Jalen Hurts. In his 2 starts for the Eagles, he's dropped 19.3 and 37.8 fantasy points. He's run the ball 29 times for 169 yards and a touchdown. And the great thing that we saw on Sunday is that he brought it together through the air too. He had 338 passing yards and 3 touchdowns. Jalen Hurts is the real deal. And in a game against Dallas this weekend, a plus matchup, he could win you a fantasy title. Add Savon Ahmed. So there was no Myles Gaskin for the Dolphins on Sunday because he had tested positive for COVID-19 last week. That allowed Savon Ahmed to work as the lead back in that backfield. Against New England, he carried the ball 23 times. He had 122 yards and a score. And he also had a 12% target share. So at the time of this recording, I don't know if Gaskin is going to play or not this week. That's the case for a lot of these running backs. But you should still plan ahead. Because the Dolphins get the Raiders, and the Raiders have allowed the 4th most adjusted fantasy points to running backs this year. Add Sony Michel. So another running back who I don't know his status of right now at the time of this recording is Damian Harris. He missed Week 15, and that allowed Sony Michel to see some work in that backfield. He carried the ball 10 times, and he had 74 yards on the ground. According to NumberFire's expected points model, he had a 50% success rate. That's a pretty strong number. So if Harris misses this week, I do think that Sony Michel is sort of an RB3. Drop Jerry Jeudy. This is another example of a player who's fairly highly rostered right now who you can drop. And the logic here is similar to the logic with Christian Kirk. Is Jerry Jeudy going to help your opponent? Predictably, probably not. Because he hasn't gotten it done. He's finished no better than wide receiver 57 in weekly scoring over his last 5 games. Even though the matchup against the Chargers isn't bad on paper, I don't know how anyone can trust Jerry Jeudy this week. Add Russell Gage. So Russell Gage has now seen a target share per game of 21.4% over the last 3 weeks, and he's averaged a solid 17.2 PPR points per game. Now, during these 3 games, he's scored no fewer than 15 points and no more than 19 points. He's been very, very consistent. Julio Jones is banged up, and the Falcons, like I talked about earlier, they get the Chiefs this week. That should be a negative game script because they're 10-point underdogs according to FanDuel Sportsbook. That means a lot of passing, and that means a nice high floor for Russell Gage. Add Baker Mayfield. Over the last 4 weeks, only Ryan Tannehill is averaging more fantasy points per game at quarterback than Baker Mayfield. Mayfield's averaging almost 25 points per game. Now, I will say it's going to be tough for Mayfield to sustain these numbers. He has a 7.1% touchdown rate over this time. But even still, he gets the Jets this week. Yes, I know New York played fine against LA this past week. But across the larger sample, they've been beat by fantasy quarterbacks. Even when you consider what they did in Week 15, the Jets have allowed the 7th most adjusted fantasy points to quarterbacks this season. That makes Baker Mayfield a viable streamer. Add Tua Tagovailoa. You could also go to Tua if you want to. He's rostered in fewer leagues than Mayfield is, and he gets a decent matchup against the Raiders. Las Vegas now ranks in the bottom half of the league in adjusted points allowed to quarterbacks, and they're coming off a game where their banged-up defense was horrible against Justin Herbert. The Dolphins have a decent 25-point implied team total. I think Tua works this week as a streamer. And by the way, he's been averaging almost 21 fantasy points per game over his last 3 contests. Add the Arizona Cardinals defense. I think the best traditional streaming defense this week has to be Arizona. They're out there in about 2/3 of leagues, and they're facing San Francisco. That San Francisco offense has given up a top 10 defensive performance in 6 of their last 7 games. Over the last 2 weeks, Washington and Dallas have been the top defense in fantasy football against San Francisco. The Cardinals are at home. They're 3.5-point favorites. I like them a lot. Add the Washington football team defense. So Washington works this week too. They're rostered in a similar number of leagues as the Cardinals are, and they're going to face the Panthers at home here in Week 16. Now with Washington, we're always intrigued by what that defensive line can do to opposing quarterbacks. They're top 10 in pressure rate this season, and only 5 teams, including the Cardinals that I just talked about, only 5 teams have more sacks than Washington. Meanwhile, Carolina is a totally average opponent. They're average in sack rate allowed. They're average in adjusted fantasy points allowed. I think all of that combined makes Washington a decent defensive streaming option. Add the Los Angeles Chargers defense. Now, the last defense that you could go to is the Chargers. They're rostered in fewer leagues in both Arizona and Washington, so you should be able to get them. And they face Denver. Quite simply, Denver is the best opponent for fantasy defenses. They've been the friendliest when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed. A lot of that has to do with the fact that Drew Lock is a gunslinger. He likes throwing the ball down the field. He'll turn the ball over, he'll take sacks, but that's what you get with Drew Lock. And if you look over at FanDuel Sportsbook, this game has a 49-point over-under, and the Chargers are 3-point favorites. I don't love the Chargers. I would much rather play Arizona or Washington, but I do think that they work. The 16th transaction this week that you can't get in my weekly 15 transactions column over on numberfire.com is to hold Tyler Lockett. So I've been talking about Tyler Lockett on this show a lot over the last 2 or 3 weeks because he hasn't been very good in fantasy football. He went absolutely nuts back in week 7 against Arizona. He scored 53 PPR points. And from weeks 1 through 7, he was averaging 23.5 fantasy points per game. Since that time, that number's dropped to 10.5. And over his last 8 games, so since that Arizona game, he's finished in the top 30 in weekly wide receiver scoring just once. He's been the wide receiver 51 in points per game. Now here's the thing. I don't think he's a great play this week against the Rams. If you can bench him, I would be benching him. But I don't know if I would just drop him. Unlike a Christian Kirk or a Jerry Jeudy, there's serious upside with Tyler Lockett. There's always a chance that Lockett goes off, that he blows up. And if that happens, your opponent might benefit from that. If your opponent is a big underdog, they can add Tyler Lockett if you drop him, and they can go for that ceiling. So this is one of those scenarios where I don't really want to play Tyler Lockett this week, but I don't want my opponent to have Tyler Lockett because we've seen that ceiling. So for these kinds of players, just hold them. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. As you can see, I dropped this show on Monday. I'm going to do my best to get a show out on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. So I will talk to you tomorrow.